was a warm autumn night, and the dry leaves crunched under the gentle wind that slipped between the trees in the neighborhood. My parents had decided to go out for dinner to celebrate their anniversary, and had left me alone at home for a few hours. I had insisted that I could handle it perfectly. After all, I was already 17 years old and had spent nights alone before. However, despite my apparent confidence, there was always something unsettling about the empty house. It was as if the absence of noise and lack of movement accentuated every little sound, every shadow, reminding me of how vulnerable I really was when no one else was around. That night, after saying goodbye to my parents with a hug and promising them I would be fine, I prepared to enjoy my solitude. The idea of having the house all to myself felt like a small luxury. I could watch whatever movie I wanted, eat whatever I fancied, and no one would be there to interrupt me. I turned on the TV in the living room, selected a thriller I had wanted to watch for weeks, and curled up on the sofa with a blanket and a big bowl of popcorn. The first few minutes of the movie passed without incident, and soon I was immersed in the plot, letting the suspense draw me in. However, as the images filled the screen, I began to notice a subtle unease, like a feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. At first I attributed it to the movie. After all, thrillers are designed to make you nervous, to make you feel like something terrible is about to happen. But as the minutes passed, that unease grew in intensity. My attention began to drift from the movie, and my eyes started to wander around the room as if I was expecting to see something out of place. The first sound that caught my attention was a creak at the back of the house. It was so faint that it could have easily been dismissed as the house settling, a loose floorboard, or maybe a branch tapping against a window. But the sound was distinct enough that my body reacted instinctively, tensing up. I paused the movie, waiting to hear something more. Anything that would confirm I wasn't alone. For a long moment, the silence was absolute, interrupted only by the distant murmur of the wind and the constant ticking of the clock on the wall. Just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was nothing, the creaking sound happened again. This time louder and clearer. It was coming from downstairs, specifically from the kitchen. My heart started pounding and a wave of irrational fear took hold of me. I got up from the sofa slowly, trying not to make a sound, as if by staying quiet I could avoid alerting whatever or whoever was there to my presence. My first instinct was to call my parents, but I hesitated, afraid of worrying them unnecessarily. Besides, I didn't want to seem like a scared little girl who couldn't handle being alone at home. Instead, I decided to investigate for myself. I moved toward the kitchen, my bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor, each step seeming to echo in the darkness that enveloped the house. The kitchen was dimly lit, only illuminated by the bluish light of the microwave clock that read 10:30 at night. I approached the window over the sink, which looked out onto the backyard, and peered outside, hoping to find some explanation for the noise I had heard. The garden was calm, the swing hung motionless, and the shadows of the trees stretched out into the darkness, swaying slightly in the breeze. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that there was nothing out of the ordinary. I closed the curtains over the window, blocking the view of the garden, and turned around to head back to the living room. But at that moment, another sound broke the silence. This time it was a thud, a dull and heavy sound that made my heart stop for a second. It was coming from upstairs, directly from the hallway leading to my room. The feeling of panic that I had been trying to keep at bay overwhelmed me completely. I knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find in the kitchen drawer, feeling the cold weight of the steel in my trembling hand. I wasn't the type to scare easily, but that night fear coursed through my veins like a paralyzing and overwhelming poison. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight, resonating in the deathly quiet of the house. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of light under the door to my room, which, to my surprise, was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it when I went downstairs to the living room. A draft of cold air was coming from the room, and my skin prickled instantly. I approached the door, my steps barely a whisper on the carpet. I pushed the door cautiously, ready for anything, but the room seemed empty. Everything was in its place, except for the window, which was now wide open, letting in the chilly night air. My first thought was that someone had entered through the window, but how and why? The feeling that something was terribly wrong intensified. I walked over to the window, looking out into the garden once more, but I didn't see anything or anyone. It was then that I heard soft footsteps behind me, as if someone was quietly approaching. I turned around in an instant, raising the knife instinctively, but there was no one in the room. The door was still slightly open, and the hallway beyond was in shadows. My heart was pounding so hard I could almost hear the beats in my ears. It was at that moment that I felt a blow to the back of my head, so sudden and violent that everything went black instantly. There was no time to scream, no time to defend myself. All I experienced was a sharp pain and then total darkness. I woke up what seemed like an eternity later, with a throbbing pain in my head and the sensation of floating in a void. The light was blinding when I finally opened my eyes, and it took several seconds for me to realize I was in a hospital. The walls were a spotless white, and the rhythmic sound of a machine monitoring my heartbeat filled the room with its constant beep-beep. I tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through my entire body, forcing me to groan. My throat was dry and my lips felt cracked, as if I hadn't had water in days. My vision was blurry and the bright lights from the ceiling made me squint. It was then that I saw the worried faces of my parents standing by my bed, their eyes filled with anguish and fear. I tried to speak, but my voice was a hoarse whisper. They told me they had found me unconscious at home, that I had been beaten so severely that I needed surgery to repair the injuries to my head. The reality of what had happened began to sink in like a heavy stone. There were no signs of a robbery, no vandalism. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been destroyed. Those men, whoever they were, hadn't entered my house to steal. They had entered to attack me, to hurt me, and I had no idea why. My mind filled with unanswered questions. Why me? Why my house? What did those men want? But none of those questions found an answer. The police had investigated but found no clues, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, except for the open window in my room. There was no apparent motive, no pattern that could indicate who my attackers were or why they did what they did. The fear I had felt that night never left me. I couldn't sleep without the lights on. I couldn't be alone at home without an irrational panic taking hold of me. Every time I heard a strange noise, my mind would go back to that night, to the feeling of being hunted in my own home. I often wondered if those men would return, if one day they would come back to finish what they started. The worst part was not knowing. The uncertainty consumed me day after day, night after night. We never found out who those men were or why they attacked me. The only thing they left behind was the terrifying memory of that night, a memory I could never erase, a scar that never fully healed. The days following my discharge from the hospital were a constant nightmare. Returning home to the place where everything had happened was an experience that made my heart clench with anxiety. My parents tried to make me feel safe, ensuring that the locks were in perfect condition, installing a security system with cameras in every corner, and reinforcing all the windows. But none of that could calm the terror that had taken root inside me. The house, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a trap where any shadow could hide a stranger with dark intentions. The nights were the worst. The silence of the early morning, which used to be something relaxing, had turned into torture. Every creak, every whisper of the wind made me jump. I would lie in bed, unable to sleep, with my eyes fixed on the door to my room, waiting for someone to appear. I constantly felt like I wasn't alone, that at any moment those men would come back to finish what they had started. And the worst part was that I couldn't explain the horror I felt to my parents without making them feel even guiltier about what had happened to me. My friends tried to help, but their presence only made me feel more alienated. They didn't know how to talk to me, how to act around me. At first, they tried to distract me with jokes or trivial conversations, but when they saw that I could barely muster a smile, they fell silent, uncomfortable. They started visiting me less and less until I eventually stopped seeing them altogether. The truth is, I couldn't blame them. I didn't know how to face what had happened to me, how to move on after something like that. One night, about a week after returning home, I woke up with my heart racing, as if someone had pushed me to the edge of a cliff in my dreams. I was drenched in sweat, and the room felt darker and more oppressive than usual. I sat up in bed trying to calm my breathing when I noticed something strange. A cold breeze coming from the hallway. Fear gripped me instantly. That feeling that something was wrong, that something was out of place, made me shudder. I got out of bed slowly, as if my movements were those of an automaton, controlled by the urgency to discover what was wrong. I approached the door to my room, my heart in my throat, and peeked out into the hallway. The house was completely silent, but the door to my parents' room, which they always kept closed at night, was slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I approached the door, pushing it gently with trembling fingers. When the door opened fully, the room was dark except for the faint light of the moon filtering through the partially open curtains. My parents were sound asleep, unaware of my presence. I wanted to wake them to tell them what I was feeling, but the words stuck in my throat. It was as if an invisible weight was crushing my chest, leaving me unable to speak. I backed out slowly, closing the door as carefully as possible to avoid making any noise. As I returned to my room, the cold breeze I had felt earlier faded, but the panic remained. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets over my head, as if that childish gesture could protect me from whatever evil lurked in the darkness. I closed my eyes tightly, praying to fall asleep, to escape from that terrifying reality. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, listening to every little sound with my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something or someone to appear. The next day was a blur. I felt exhausted, as if I hadn't slept at all. My parents' faces showed concern, but I said nothing. I couldn't let them know how terrified I was. They had already done everything they could to protect me, but it was clear that no security measure could keep the fear that now lived inside me at bay. As the weeks passed, my condition only worsened. I started avoiding leaving the house, afraid that the men were waiting outside, ready to attack me again. The idea of going back to school, of being surrounded by people who didn't understand what I was going through, was unbearable. My parents, worried, decided that the best thing to do was to seek professional help. They took me to see a therapist, a man in his 50s with a soft voice and a reassuring demeanor. At first I resisted talking, feeling like no one could understand what I was going through. But little by little, the sessions began to help. Talking to someone who wasn't involved, who didn't look at me with pity or concern, allowed me to open up about what had happened, about how I felt trapped in my own body and mind. The therapist taught me breathing techniques to control anxiety and encouraged me to face my fears little by little instead of hiding from them. But even though his words gave me some relief during the sessions, the terror still took hold of me every night. Returning to normalcy seemed like an unattainable goal, and there was nothing anyone could say or do to change how I felt. The nightmares became a constant. In them, I would relive the night of the attack over and over again, but with variations that made it even more terrifying. Sometimes the men would return, but this time they wouldn't just beat me. They would also drag me out of the house, taking me to some unknown place. Other times I would find myself trapped in darkness, unable to move, while I heard their footsteps coming closer and closer. The impact on my daily life was devastating. I stopped seeing my friends altogether, distancing myself from any social contact. My studies suffered, and eventually my parents decided that the best thing for me was to take some time off from school. I spent most of the day in my room, locked in, only coming out for therapy sessions. I had lost all sense of security, all confidence that the world was a reasonably safe place. The police continued to investigate, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no signs of who those men could have been. The weeks turned into months, and the case eventually was shelved, unsolved. We never found out why those men chose my house, why they attacked me so brutally, or what motivated them not to steal or cause any other kind of harm. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere just to unleash their violence on me, and then disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. The fact that there were no answers, that I didn't know who they were or if they would come back, was a burden I carried with me everywhere. No matter how many times the therapist told me I was safe, that the chances of something like that happening again were extremely low. The uncertainty was like a constant shadow, lurking around every corner, waiting for the right moment to pounce on me. Finally, after many months, I began to rebuild my life, though I was never the same. I accepted that some questions would never have answers, and that maybe the only thing I could do was learn to live with the fear. But even now, years later, there are nights when I wake up startled, feeling the cold of that inexplicable breeze, waiting to hear those soft, almost inaudible footsteps, always remembering the night my life changed forever. Most kids get excited about the possibility of spending a night alone without their parents' supervision. It usually means staying up late, watching horror movies, and eating junk food. That's what I imagined that October night as I begged and negotiated with my parents. "I'm 11 years old now," I said, trying to sound like a mature adult. "I don't need a babysitter, please." My parents were going out of town for a night due to a work commitment, and after much begging, pleading, and immature whining, they gave in and allowed me to stay home alone. "It's just one night," my dad whispered to my worried mom in a consoling tone. "He'll be fine." I ran to my room, excited about the upcoming night of unsupervised fun. It wouldn't be long before that excitement turned into panic and terror, making it the worst night of my life. It wasn't long before my mom kissed me goodbye, smiling anxiously. "Call us if you need anything at all, okay?" "Yes, Mom." I rolled my eyes. I set my glass of ice water on the coffee table in the living room and let my mom hug me. We finished our goodbyes, and before long, the door closed. I was alone, unsupervised, for the first time in my life. Fear began to settle in the pit of my stomach. What if something really bad happened? Who would I call? What would I do? I heard my parents' car pull out of the driveway, and the tickle of fear grew stronger, flooding my mind. I ran upstairs to my bedroom window, which gave me a clear view of the front of the house. My parents were still in the driveway, pulling away. I watched them, with my forehead pressed against the glass as rain began to fall on the window, obscuring my view of their car driving away. Their car grew more distant, smaller and smaller. They turned left at the end of our street and disappeared. I stood frozen, my face against the glass. I regretted asking to stay alone. What if there was an emergency? What if I burned the house down? My eyes filled with tears. I continued staring out the window for minutes, hoping their car would reappear, turn onto our street, and pull into our driveway, where they would tell me their event was canceled and they would stay home with me. The street light at the corner flickered, snapping me out of my daydream. It was getting dark. "It's okay," I whispered to myself. "If I don't do anything stupid, I should be fine." I began to walk away from the window when something made me turn back. Under the streetlight, two figures turned the corner and started walking towards my side of the street. They were wearing black sweaters and pants. One looked paranoid, constantly looking around, while the other nudged him and gestured for him to look straight ahead. I watched as panic began to set in again. Were they coming here? It couldn't be. That would be ridiculous, right? The figures passed the first house on the street. They passed the second. They passed the third. My house was next. "Keep walking," I whispered in a trembling voice. But they didn't keep walking. The pair of men stopped right in front of my house while one gestured toward the empty driveway. They argued, and the rain started to fall harder. They approached my front door. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest now. I let out a small gasp when the doorbell rang. What did they want? Why were they here? I tiptoed down the stairs and stood on the welcome mat by the entryway. I stared at the door as the doorbell rang again. I pressed my ear against the cold wooden door. I could hear them now. "See?" one said. "There's no one here." I saw them loading up luggage into their car, and I saw them leave. "They won't be back all night." "I don't know, man," said the other, with fear lacing his every word. "Shut up," said the other. The doorknob began to rattle violently. I pressed my hands over my mouth to suppress a scream. "Screw this," said the paranoid one. "Let's just go through the window and get off the street. Everyone can see us." Before I had time to react, the window beside the door shattered, sending shards of glass onto the wooden floor. With no time to think, I ran upstairs. "This can't be happening," I kept repeating to myself as I climbed the stairs as quietly as possible. I looked down as I turned into my parents' room. A body emerged from the broken window, making my stomach drop. I closed the door and slid under the bed. Had they seen me? Did they hear the click of the door closing? Did they know I was there? I lay face down, my mind assuming the worst. From my hiding spot, I watched the small sliver of light under the door. The sound of breaking glass echoed from downstairs, followed by the scraping of furniture being dragged across the floor, and finally, voices. "There's someone here," said a calm but firm voice. "What? How do you know?" said another with fear in every word. "This water is cold, it still has ice." Under the bed, I broke into a cold sweat after hearing those words. I focused on listening for anything else, but nothing followed. The silence was deafening. Minutes of complete silence passed that felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the soft and subtle creak of the wooden floor echoed, followed by the soft click of a door quietly closing. They were in my room. I watched the sliver of light under the door. The creaking continued, growing louder and closer. My panic grew. My fear became reality. Suddenly, two dark spots appeared under the door. blocking the bright strip of light from outside my parents' room. They were there. The door slowly creaked open. Now I could see 2 pairs of feet under the threshold. "I know you're here," said a calm voice. It sounded mocking and playful. "You can come out, we won't hurt you." The other voice let out a laugh. Motionless, I watched as the 2 men split up. They went around the perimeter of the bed, and I quickly lost sight of one. The other stood directly in front of me. I could have reached out and untied his shoelaces. "I wonder where he is," said the one in front of me. "Is he in the closet, behind the curtains, or maybe he's under the bed?" As he said the last word, a pair of hands grabbed my ankles and began to drag me out. I screamed in terror, but a massive hand covered my mouth. I writhed, kicked, and struggled, but it was in vain. 2 enormous arms wrapped around me, rendering me immobile. The man who had been in front of me approached. "Sleep," he whispered. He pulled out a damp cloth and placed it over my mouth and nose. Everything began to go dark. Seconds later, I lost consciousness. I woke up in a dark, damp room. I was lying on cold concrete with a thin blanket. My body ached and my mouth was incredibly dry. I sat up, dazed, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. A single bulb hung from a cord in the center of the room, which had no windows or decorations. I scanned the perimeter, trying to orient myself, to no avail. In the corner of the room, there was a staircase. Minutes passed when a loud bang sounded from above. Muffled shouting was heard, followed by bangs and crashes. I shrank in fear and curled up on the floor, covering the back of my head with my hands. The fight above escalated as a series of loud bangs continued. Then, total and complete silence. A minute passed, and the silence was broken by the loud creak of a heavy door opening, echoing in the damp room. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for more pain. "Miguel," said a strong voice. "Miguel, are you here?" I remained silent. "I'm Officer Garrison. I'm here to help you." I lifted my head, let out a cry of recognition, and felt hope for the first time in days. Tears flowed from my mom's eyes as she hugged me tightly after we were reunited at the police station. What felt like an eternity, my parents held me in the detective's office. I could have stayed in their embrace forever. Finally, Officer Garrison explained that the pair of thieves had been watching my house for days. They noticed my parents leaving with luggage and assumed they would be gone for a long time. As soon as they left, they took advantage of a vacant house ready to be ransacked. But when they found out I was there, they didn't know what to do. I was an obstacle in their plan. They drugged me and placed me in the basement of their house. However, while they were carrying my unconscious body and placing it in the back of their truck, which was hidden around the corner of our street, a camera at the top of the streetlight caught their license plate. The next day, my parents arrived, and within minutes my house was filled with detectives and police. After an investigation, the footage from the streetlight camera was used to track down my kidnappers. Decades have passed since that horrible day, and I am eternally grateful that camera was placed at the top of that streetlight. Sometimes I think about the horrible fate that would have awaited me if that footage hadn't been discovered. A couple of years ago, I lived in a big house with a bunch of other guys. We all shared the rent because it was much cheaper. We were all short on money due to college, except for me. Out of the 5 of us living there, I was the only one not enrolled in the local university. One of the guys living there happened to be a friend of mine. I was looking for a room to rent near my job, and they had the space. It worked out well for me because I was terrible with my money and really couldn't afford much. As you can imagine, it got pretty loud very quickly. Every weekend brought a mini party to our house, and we were absolutely here for it. Alcohol, drugs, dozens and dozens of guys and girls. I hit the jackpot because these guys had a good network at the university. We were never short of anything and always made sure to keep things consistent. If it was a Friday or Saturday night, our doors were wide open. Even if one of us was sick or something, we were afraid of missing out on a weekend, so we wanted to keep the party at our house as much as possible. It only took one bad night for all that fear of missing out to go away. The house itself wasn't the same after that, and I ended up moving out shortly after. The other guys had to stay because their incomes were limited, and their names were on the lease. It was so close to the school that I had the freedom to save up and get out of the mess as soon as I was ready. Honestly, I don't remember what night it was, but the house was packed and the walls were vibrating with music, dancing, shouting, everything. It was literally a rave in our living room. a high-end bar in the kitchen. Of course, 2 of our roommates worked as bartenders, so they knew how to mix a drink and create an atmosphere. There were smoke machines, costumes, all kinds of fun stuff. Walking into the kitchen was like walking into a casino lounge or something. A couple of the guys decorated their rooms each week with different themes, like a jungle or a spaceship, which only added to the vibe. It also increased their chances of having a girl stay the night with them. I can honestly say that this group of guys was honest and completely legit. They would never harm anyone or lure them into a weird situation. It's one of the main reasons why so many people were happy to come to our parties. It was always clean fun, no drama, no weirdness, nothing, just music, alcohol, and a good time. The night progressed as usual, but around 11 or maybe midnight, there was a commotion in the backyard. We had a big lawn, a small patio, a fire pit, the whole package. You've got to remember that I was totally high on those weekends, so a lot of the details escaped me. I can tell you that there was never any commotion at our parties. So the second we heard something in the yard, we knew we had to check it out. 5 of us lived there, but only 2 of us, me and one of the bartenders, went out to investigate. There was a small circle of people, so the commotion was easy to find. 2 guys were facing off in some kind of shouting match and were getting physical. It was obvious since their clothes and hair were disheveled. One guy looked cleaner and the bartender knew him, so we pulled him aside to hear the story. I kept my eye on the crowd, but mainly on the guy involved in the fight. I don't know how else to say it, but he looked strange. He had long, unkempt hair, and his beard was so uneven that I almost thought it was on purpose. He was wearing dirty, baggy clothes, no shoes. And the more I looked at him, the more sure I was that we didn't know this guy. I realized that our parties might have gotten a bit too big from time to time, and the wrong people on campus were starting to find out that they could get drunk almost for free. As I inspected this guy, we made eye contact, and he stared at me. "What's up, man? What's going on out here?" I floated toward him. "Nothing, mind your own business, just a misunderstanding," he explained. I had drunk too much at that point, and I remember getting irritated to the point of violence. "Mind my own business? Okay, this is my house, my party, get it? You're causing trouble directly for me, so if I ask you what's going on, you need to tell me because it's more my business than yours, got it?" He started taking a couple of steps toward me, which frankly I wasn't really prepared for. But I didn't back down. I could feel the fury boiling just beneath my skin, and this guy just didn't seem to care. At that moment, the bartender and his friend came back along with another girl. It turns out the friend was a pretty straight guy, and the girl was his girlfriend. They both corroborated the whole story. They said the weird guy was being weird, dancing all over the yard and singing, but not in English, like the craziest speech you've ever heard. Then he started stumbling into people before spilling a drink on his friend's girlfriend, apologizing and then trying to clean it up with his bare hands. All this was explained, and I turned back to the guy who was now looking between all of us. He hadn't backed down, still had that crazy look in his eyes. "What's up, man?" I asked. "Does that sound like what happened?" The guy immediately started arguing, getting even more agitated. He looked around and saw the crowd of people literally closing in from all angles. We'd been throwing parties for 4 months at this point, so a lot of these people had become our friends. The guy realized he was outnumbered and started to calm down, began pointing fingers, saying we cultivated a toxic environment, all kinds of new age nonsense. We let him gather his things and then threw him out the front door. Nothing physical, but we made it very clear that if he ever came back, we'd call the police, and that would be the least of his worries. After that, everything went back to normal. Music, dancing, drinking, drugs. That night turned into one of those where I really let loose, especially after kicking the weirdo out. Within 30 minutes of closing the door behind him, I took 3 shots and did a couple of lines of coke. To say I felt good was an understatement, not just because of the substance, but because I'd humiliated that idiot earlier. Something about the way he confronted me pissed me off immediately, and obviously I kept thinking about him. Then the come-down started. People began to leave one by one at first, then in small groups. I found myself hanging out with some people who were usually the last to go, mainly because the party didn't really stop for them. They were the cocaine suppliers. They always brought large amounts, because with their choice of substance, they weren't going to leave our house and go home. No, they just went from club to club and party to party near the university. While I was getting high with that crowd, I didn't notice that a couple of my roommates had actually left with some of the guests. The 2 bartenders left with a couple of girls, my personal friend, and the one who got me the room left with some guys to another party just down the street. That left me and the last roommate, who was already passed out in his room. I was riding the wave of alcohol in my bloodstream, the stimulants wearing off. The drug suppliers said their goodbyes, and most went out the front door, leaving me alone with the rumbling bass and the smoke dissipating from the kitchen. There was no way I was going to sleep. I didn't have to work the next day, so I decided to start cleaning up the house. This was usually done as a group, but since I was high and alone, I tackled it solo. I started with the glasses, liquor bottles, various forms of trash. I had 2 very full trash bags after half an hour. I drank beer and whiskey as I worked, just to keep the party alive a little longer and take the edge off the drugs that were quickly leaving my system. That's when I heard my roommate moving. I looked down the hallway, and there he was again. But he wasn't actually coming from the room of the guy still in the house. He was coming from one of the bartender's rooms, the corner one with the windows facing the street. I thought for a second that maybe I was confused, that he hadn't left and was still hanging around his room. It wasn't unusual for this particular roommate to disappear into his room. He was playing a lot of World of Warcraft at the time. There was a part of me that needed to see what that noise was, since it seemed to be getting louder with each passing moment. That part was probably the drug-induced paranoia. I grabbed a few things off the counter, a hoodie and a phone charger that belonged to the roommate in question, and then walked down our hallway. I was taking some heavy steps, even bumping into the wall so he'd know I was coming to that side of the house. It wasn't unusual for us to accidentally run into each other in various states of undress. I got to the end of the hallway, and his door was partially open. Fine, I nudged it with my foot, and who do I see? Not the guy who lives in this room, not even someone who lives in the damn house. It's that idiot from earlier, and he's smiling the second our eyes meet. The sound I was hearing was his failed attempt to climb through the window, unable to deal with the blinds in any way other than knocking them around. They were those cheap, thin metal blinds, and they were currently bent and broken beyond repair because the guy coming in had an arm through them. I wish I could say I ran and threw him back out the window, but the paranoia growing in my head turned into full-blown panic. I dropped the jacket and phone charger like randomly and bolted back the way I came. I had no idea what to do and just wanted to put some space between me and whoever this guy really was. I looked back, and I swear to God this lunatic was in slow motion walking through the smoke in the hallway with that same crazy smile. Only when I looked down did I see that his hands were gripping something, knuckles white and trembling. It was dark and smoky, so I couldn't make it out well, but it was shaped like a wrench or maybe the length of a pipe, something to hit with. I rounded the corner and made it into the kitchen, and I looked at the knife magnet. We like to have flashy decor, so all our chef's knives hung on these cool bamboo boards on the wall. Secretly, I'd rehearsed this kind of scenario in my head before, and I knew exactly which knife I was going to grab, the fillet knife, clean and sharp. If you're not familiar, it's the thin one in the block, probably 5 or 7 inches long, and is used to cut fat from meat or fillet fish, any kind of precise cut you need. It shined in our house because we rarely used it. I just remember working at a neighborhood restaurant in high school, where they taught me about different knives for different jobs and which ones worked best. Fillet knives are usually the sharpest and have the most penetrating power. My plan was to bury the entire blade in this guy's neck or collarbone when he came around the corner. He'd be out of commission, no doubt. It was more violent than I usually am, but he'd taken me by surprise, and I was in a pretty unstable headspace anyway. I remembered my roommate was in the house. "Derek!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. I was about to say, "Wake up," when I realized the guy in the house didn't know I was alone, and he didn't know Derek was asleep. "There's a guy in the house, the guy we kicked out earlier, let's kick his ass." There was no response, of course, but the footsteps I could hear in the hallway stopped. I thought my bluff was working, or at least that's what I thought. I remembered our earlier exchange that night and felt the fury coming back. I could see the sun starting to come up through the windows now. "Derek," I tried again. I heard the sweetest thing then he called back to me. I wasn't as drunk as I thought. His room was right behind where the guy was, so he practically had him cornered. Suddenly I could hear them struggling right in the hallway. I ran and turned to look. Derek had the guy wrapped up from behind, the pipe was on the floor, so I assumed the guy was disarmed and ran at him from the front. Big mistake. Although he was coherent and flexible enough to push me off and kick me straight in the face. I'm not a particularly tall guy, and this dude had legs for days. I crashed sideways into the wall, dropped the knife, thank God, which fell harmlessly to the floor and skidded away from us. This guy started howling, which was scary as hell, but it actually brought me back to the moment, Like the couple explained earlier about his chanting, he was shouting strange words none of us had heard before. I got up and helped Derek bring the guy to the ground, then he told me to run and call the police. That idea had never occurred to me. Probably because of all the drugs I'd consumed, it felt like calling the police to my own party. Eventually they came, along with some paramedics, and they cuffed him and diagnosed him with a little help from the guy's confession. He'd been high on LSD all night. He was wandering around the university campus crying under the effects of acid when he heard some people talking about the party at our house. He got in the car and went off in his hallucinatory state. This guy managed to navigate the neighborhood until he found the same damn car parked outside our house. Like I said, we were very close to the university. They took the guy away, and Derek and I declined to go to the hospital. I was sober by then and grateful not to be going to jail. Derek was desperate to get back to bed. We weren't seriously hurt, and that kick to my face was pretty superficial, like toes against my forehead. We both took some ibuprofen, drank a beer, and put some ice on for a while before going to bed. Like I said at the beginning, I didn't live there much longer after that. It wasn't anything personal with the guys. I still hung out with them from time to time. But I really didn't want to vomit where I ate, if you know what I mean. I didn't want to live in the same place where the party was happening. That night taught me a lot about myself and what I'm made of. Drugs, paranoia, and nighttime stalkers. It turns out that's not for me. My older sibling and I were home in a small town in Ohio, with fewer people than there were in my mom's graduating class from the city we came from. My sibling was grounded. Both the house phone and their own phone were locked away in my dad's gun safe, the combination to which neither of us knew. The reason for the grounding was something silly and arbitrary. I can't remember exactly why. Our grandparents lived at the end of the street, and our great-grandmother lived in a small house they had built on that property so she could be independent, though they were nearby. Our parents told us they were going to check on my great-grandmother since our grandparents were out of town that day. They said that when they returned, we'd order pizza, which sounded good to me, a 7-year-old, and to my 15-year-old sibling, who I'll call Evangelina. We played video games for a while, and we both started getting hungry, quickly wondering when our parents would be back. I'd say that after about 2 hours of them being gone, we heard a knock at the door. I went downstairs pretty excited about the food. My sibling followed closely behind. I approached the door, which had a large window, and it wasn't our parents, but a very tall, thin white man with short black hair and a scruffy beard. I'd say he was about 24 or 25 years old. It was quite shocking because in that small town, everyone knew each other and we had no idea who he was. I held up a finger as if to say, 1 second, and then closed the curtain. I turned around to see Evangelina staring at the door in disbelief because she had seen the person too. A few seconds later, that knock turned into loud banging, and then shaking and movements of the doorknob. We were both terrified, with no way to call our parents. Evangelina grabbed my hand and led me running to the kitchen. She grabbed a knife, and I clearly remember it breaking in her hand. It broke in the sense that the small blade fell off the handle. Back then, for some reason, our kitchen was filled with broken things. Lots of rusty utensils, makeshift items, and of course all kinds of things that were broken or would break. Despite that, we both hid in the laundry room and hugged each other, still hearing the banging on the door. It lasted about 5 minutes, which felt like hours. Then we heard the front door open. One thing I'll say about my sibling is that they've always been ready to protect me in a heartbeat. They were ready to jump out with that broken knife and defend me the moment the man reached us. Instead, it was my mom who rounded the corner with 2 pizza boxes in hand, wondering why her 2 kids were in a heap of tears on the floor. We both got up and ran to tell her about the man outside, but she laughed. My dad was outside talking to him. She said the man was asking about a broken-down car that had been sitting in our driveway for months. Apparently, he was a mechanic. My mom felt terrible but found the situation somewhat funny. Apparently, she went out and told the man, and he said he felt bad for scaring us. We got hugs and were promised that the phones would not be locked away the next time they left. We spent the rest of the afternoon eating pizza with intermittent sobs. Something still bothers me, though it didn't when I was a child, and it's something I never thought about. Why would a grown man knock on the door like that, shake the handle, do everything he could to get into a house, whether the parents were home or a little kid signaled that they were going to get their parents? Why would someone want to talk about a car that didn't have any for sale sign, especially at 9 or 10 at night? It's a little scary that my parents took it so lightly, but something in my gut, especially now that I'm an adult, tells me that's not how adults behave. At least not normal ones. The man's name turned out to be Christian. He came to the house a few more times that week to inspect the car. The first time he came, our parents were home. He lifted the hood and got under the car, checking pretty much everything he could. From what I remember, everything was friendly that first visit, except that sometimes I'd notice him looking at me and Evangelina, giving us that weird, creepy smile. He came back a few days later that same week, but the next time was at an odd time again, and our parents weren't home. Now that we knew the guy, Evangelina opened the door for him. "Sorry to bother you," Christian began. "No problem. But our parents aren't here. You'll have to come back tomorrow," she explained. "Oh, it's no big deal. I just wanted to check the tires and fenders. It won't take long." Evangelina gave him the go-ahead and then closed the door. We watched him from the living room window as he went back to his own car, an old beat-up thing, and rummaged in the trunk, then headed to the car he wanted to buy. He did exactly what he said he was going to do, and after a few minutes we got bored. We almost left the window and went back to what we were doing, but he did something strange that immediately caught our attention. He turned around and walked straight to the house, taking pictures of the exterior. He took photos of the sides, the front, the second floor, and almost went to the backyard. That's when he saw us staring wide-eyed from the main window. He put the camera away and waved, then pointed to the front door as if suggesting we meet him there. Evangelina came over and told me to stay by the phone. If anything happened, she told me to call 911 and then Dad. This was the time when everyone had landlines, so even being in first or second grade at the time, I knew all my close friends' and parents' phone numbers by heart. It was just part of being social back then. They talked for a minute before Evangelina closed the door again and came back. She was as pale as a sheet of paper. She looked empty, completely different from her usual self. I asked her what happened and if I should call, but she shook her head. To this day, I still don't know what Christian said to Evangelina. She's always been reserved about it, but it definitely left me with a very unsettling feeling for years afterward, especially with my imagination running wild with all sorts of theories. She said something to our parents once they got home. I remember my dad going to his office to call Christian. He entered angry, with heavy steps. We could hear his stern voice through the door, but eventually it softened. He hung up and came out. He explained that it was some kind of misunderstanding, very similar to that first experience we had with him. "But he was taking pictures of the house," I said. My dad quickly gave me a strange look. "He what?" "He took pictures of the house with one of those paper cameras." "Paper cameras," my dad repeated, asking for clarification. "Yes, like a disposable camera with a cardboard wrapper," my mom said, addressing my sibling. "Yes, like that," she almost shouted. I felt like we were finally getting somewhere. "Well," my dad said, "I'm sure there's some explanation, but I'm not going to call him back now. I'll talk to him later." That was it. We were sent to bed like kids who didn't know anything. I remember lying in the dark most of the night, staring at the window, wondering if I'd see a flash of light through the blinds. "Why the hell would he come to take pictures of our house?" Evangelina said. "Probably so he could break in. He'd have an outside layout of all the ins and outs." And I guess in my childish brain that made sense, but it really, really scared me. The next time Christian came was the following Monday. I was home alone. We got out of school at the usual time and took the bus as usual, but when Evangelina and I got off the bus, she let me in and then walked a few streets over to her friend's house. It wasn't uncommon for her to leave me alone for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then she'd run back home just before our parents got home from work. I didn't mind being home alone because I could watch whatever I wanted, eat snacks, all that. Well, not even 5 minutes had passed after I sat on the couch with my juice box and gummies when someone knocked on the door. I froze in place and tried to disappear into the cushions. I remember trying not to pee my pants. You have to remember I was 6 or 7 years old at the time. I shouldn't have been unsupervised. Fortunately, I knew not to open the door, so I did the only thing that made sense. I pretended no one was home. Whoever it was would leave soon, right? Except they didn't leave. That persistent knocking turned into loud bangs. Dare I say it felt familiar. It was that same aggressive knock from our first experience with the man. I knew something was wrong and that it was him, so I didn't even bother going to a window. I just stayed on the couch until finally, to my relief, it stopped. I had been watching the clock on the radio for 9 minutes that passed while he knocked on the door, even longer than the first time. Christian was truly unhinged. With that, he didn't leave. I watched in horror as he sneaked around one side of the house, checking the dining room window, the biggest one he could reach. I remember my throat almost closing up from anxiety when I heard it open. I felt the warm air coming in from the patio. He leaned in and looked into the living room. We stared at each other. He lifted a hand and then waved like a puppet or something and then gave me that horrible smile. "Hello," he began. I said nothing. "Are Mom and Dad home?" he asked. Still nothing from me. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He crawled completely through the window frame. Even being inside the house, I couldn't move. To this day, it was the scariest experience of my life. I couldn't see what he was doing as he moved through the house, somewhere down the hallway on the other side of the dining room. The only things down there were Evangelina's bedroom and my parents' bedroom, and the front door to the outside, before finally returning to me in the living room. He never came back down the hall, so wherever he went, it was in one of those rooms. He eventually returned, waved goodbye, and then climbed back out the window. I'll never forget watching his arm slide through the window, closing the blind behind him. Really creepy, covering his tracks right in front of me. I knew I was just a kid, that it was possible no one would believe me, and I think he was counting on that. Eventually, my sibling came back and found me hysterical on the couch. I started shaking after he left from fear. I spilled my juice box on the couch, which made me panic even more, thinking I was going to get in more trouble now. Anyway, I told her what happened, or I tried to. I watched her face twist in concern until she finally understood what I was saying. Christian came, knocked on the door before just letting himself into the house. "Did he touch you?" she asked. I shook my head. Evangelina nodded and ran to the phone, called my dad, and before I knew it, both parents were walking through the front door. They interrogated me pretty thoroughly, making sure staying on the couch wasn't a big deal. The only thing they wanted to know was what had happened with Christian. I eventually told them what I could and where he went in the house. "Which window?" my dad asked. I pointed to the dining room one. "Okay, and then where did he go?" "Down the hall," I said. "Okay, and then what?" I shook my head and started crying again. My parents and Evangelina shared a look and then agreed to go check their bedrooms. They understood he must have gone into one of them. A few minutes later, I heard Evangelina make a strange sound, like a choked scream. Our parents quickly ran over. At the time, I wasn't sure what they found, but later I learned that all sorts of her things were missing. Underwear, a hairbrush, pictures from her corkboard, super creepy stalker stuff. My dad called Christian nonstop over the next 24 hours, but never got him to answer. He never came back for the car, never paid for it, never picked it up. The whole thing was a ruse to get close to us, the girls. Christian would eventually be arrested years later when I was in high school. We all had that "what the hell" moment when we saw his picture in the newspaper. It turned out Christian wasn't even his real name, and he certainly wasn't a mechanic. He was a professional voyeur and sexual predator, known for targeting families. I consider us very lucky to have gotten out of that situation when we did. Knowing I was home alone with someone so violent, creepy, and unpredictable is a nauseating thought, and everyone in my family shares it. His record of crimes and abuses is horrifying and seems to have only gotten worse after our initial encounter with him. As for our incident, my parents called the police and filed a report, but we never saw him again, until that photo in the newspaper about 10 years later. I remember my dad periodically calling the number Christian had given us, just to see if anyone answered. He did that for years. Part of me wonders what he would have said if Christian had picked up. Summer had just begun. The two people I was living with at the time were outdoor enthusiasts. In the summer, they spent every weekend camping, hiking, paddleboarding, mountain biking, and more. Name an outdoor activity, and they had at least tried it. After enduring a rainy spring, a weekend finally arrived with a forecast of sunny skies and warm weather. They were thrilled. For days, they talked about all the possible things they could do. They wanted to kick off the summer in the best way possible, so they decided to go camping at a lake so they could go paddleboarding. I was happy for them because they were so excited. I won't lie, though, I dreaded being alone for the weekend. A few months before this incident, I had a nasty breakup. We had been together for 3 years, and I caught her cheating on me with her best friend, the one she always told me I didn't need to worry about. That's how these things always end, right? In the summer, we used to go hiking together, relax by the pool, and take little weekend getaways. But now I didn't know what I'd do with my time. Normally, when summer arrived, I was excited to get outside. This year, I was apprehensive. I didn't really have anyone to do things with. I could tag along with my roommates, but I could never keep up with them, which resulted in them hiding their frustration with me. This year, I was going to be hiding indoors, playing video games with the blinds closed. When my roommates asked what I was going to do while they were away, I was honest. They felt bad. One of them commented that my ex was a lying jerk and that I was better off without her. I agreed. They suggested I try going out and meeting people. One told me to just dive into dating apps and have some fun. The other recommended I join a club or something to try to meet people with similar interests. Both options were good, but I had no idea how to find good clubs, so I opted for the dating apps. Before my roommates left, they helped me create a profile. They picked my photos, and together we thought of a bio. We decided on just looking to meet new people and have some fun, and added a winking emoji. My roommates left early the next morning. Before I woke up, I spent the day killing time. I played video games, made an elaborate sandwich for lunch, walked my roommate's dog, and played more video games. I was bored, and the idea of messaging my ex crossed my mind. I'd heard that she and her friend hadn't worked out. She had tried to contact me about a month ago, but I ignored her. I shook my head. I couldn't do that. I couldn't go back to a cheater. I paused my game and pulled out my phone to open Tinder. I started swiping right. To my surprise, there were a lot of girls who were my type. It felt like I was swiping right on every girl, but I still didn't have any matches. After swiping for 15 minutes with no matches, I gave up. I tossed my phone aside and resumed my game. Just as I hit play on the game, my phone lit up. "You have a match," the screen said. Then another notification popped up. New message. I paused my game again and grabbed my phone. I had matched with a girl named Sasha, which is an attractive girl's name. I looked at her photos, and Sasha was indeed an attractive girl. She was out of my league. She had long, wavy blonde hair and striking blue eyes. Her message was, "Hi." My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't believe a girl like Sasha was seriously talking to me. I started thinking of a reply. I needed something flirty, confident, and something that would start a conversation. I prayed we'd have a fun chat. I looked at her bio, but it was empty, so I was on my own to come up with something clever. After 10 minutes, I had nothing, so I simply replied, "Hi, what are you up to?" My plan was to try to hang out with her that night. She responded right away. "Not much. Do you have any ideas of something we can do?" My heart skipped a beat. She wanted to do something with me too. I invited her over after dinner to watch a movie and hopefully something more. Sasha was delighted and agreed. I looked around and the place was a mess. I immediately started cleaning so Sasha wouldn't be put off. I ate a light dinner and showered an hour before the time she said she'd come over. I didn't want anything to ruin my chances with her. Running around, I realized that I was finally happy. This was the most excitement I'd had in months. Just as the clock struck 9, there was a knock at the door. My heart started pounding in my chest. I opened the door to reveal a petite girl with short jet black hair. Sasha was blonde and curvy, and the girl before me was respectfully very thin. There was no way the two were the same person. "Hi," I said. "Hi," the girl said with a big smile. "Brandon, right? I'm Sasha." She extended her hand to shake mine. I wondered if it would be rude to say she looked different from her pictures, but I decided to wait for the right moment. "Yeah, nice to meet you in person." I tried to sound excited and invited her in. "Would you like something to drink? I have water, beer, or wine." "I'm more of a cocktail girl. Do you have anything stronger in a mixer?" "No, sorry, just beer and wine," I replied. Sasha opted for the wine. "Oh my God, do you know my sister?" My heart stopped. She was looking at the one photo of my ex that I had left. "Britt?" I asked. Sasha smiled and nodded. "Yeah," I responded cautiously. "How do you know her?" "You won't believe this," she started explaining as I prepared our drinks. I handed her a glass of wine. "She's my sister. We're not very close, but I thought I knew all her friends." I could feel the color drain from my face. Britt had mentioned that she had a sister, but I didn't remember what she'd told me about her. She had been sent away for some reason. Being with her sister would be good revenge, I thought. "No way," I acted interested. "Yeah, she's a friend of my roommate," I lied. Sasha's smile widened. I wanted to change the subject. Want to watch a movie? She nodded. Okay, let me just go to the bathroom, but you can start looking and see if anything catches your eye. I'm down to watch anything. I left her on the couch with our drinks on the coffee table. In the bathroom, I brushed my teeth just in case. I wanted to be as fresh as possible. She wasn't the Victoria's Secret model she pretended to be, but I liked the idea of getting revenge on Britt. I tried to remember what Britt had told me about her sister. Britt's sister was significantly younger than her, but Sasha seemed to be at least 20. Britt was 25. I remembered the age gap was bigger than that. I walked out and Sasha had made herself comfortable. How about something scary? She offered. I agreed and she started playing one of the Conjuring movies. I'm not sure which one. My mind was busy trying to remember how old this girl was. She'd already lied to me about her appearance, so I wasn't sure if she was being honest about her age. How old are you? I forgot what your profile said. 22, she replied. I knew that was a lie. I smiled and nodded. Okay, just wanted to make sure. You can never be too careful. My friend got into trouble because he messed around with a girl who lied about her age. Can't imagine. She acted like that was the most horrible thing she'd ever heard. We focused on the movie. It was hard to pay attention because I kept trying to remember what Britt had told me about her sister. She said she was crazy. I wasn't sure I wanted to sleep with her anymore because Sasha had already lied to me so much. As the movie progressed, Sasha scooted closer and closer. When something jumped on the screen, she buried her head in my chest. I put my arm around her to play along, but alarm bells were going off in my head. When the family's cat died in the movie, everything Britt had told me about her sister came flooding back. I'd only met her sister once 3 years ago when she was 14, so she was now 17. My heart started racing with anxiety. Britt told me they had to send her away because she kept killing the family pets. Her parents finally intervened when she operated on the child she was babysitting. She sliced open the kid's arm and played with his veins. The kid ended up with nerve damage and no longer had full use of his hand. Afterward, Britt said her sister told her that she wanted to see human bones still inside the body. I felt like I was going to throw up. Her sister in that first encounter clung to me. She wouldn't leave me alone. At the time, I thought it was cute that she had a crush on me. Britt didn't see it as cute. She acted disturbed. She told me later that her sister wasn't normal and had never had romantic feelings for anyone. I wasn't sure what that meant. I stopped the movie and turned to her. You know, I'm really tired. I'm sorry to cut this short, but I think you should go. Her bright eyes darkened. You don't like me or something? No, it's not that. I'm just tired. You seem fine to me. She pulled away from me but didn't seem like she was going to leave. Okay, I lied. I thought honesty would be best. I used to date your sister. We were together for 3 years. At first I thought it would be okay. Your sister doesn't have any interest in me, but I can't get it out of my head that this is wrong. It's not wrong, she said, not fazed by my revelation. I know you used to date Britt. I remember you. Then why did you act like you didn't know? I asked, a bit of anger in my voice. I didn't want to scare you. I've had a crush on you for a long time, she said with a mischievous smile, not seductive but malevolent. Sasha stood up and started inspecting the apartment again. She ran her finger along my roommate's trinkets and books. You're also 17. I'm going to be 18 in a couple of months. I won't tell anyone. She tried to seem innocent. I shook my head. I'd like you to leave now. I headed toward the door. Behind me, I heard her growl and she lunged at me. I turned to see she had grabbed a heavy glass item that belonged to my roommate and was charging at me. I stepped aside and she crashed into the door. She must have hit her head because she crumpled to the floor and seemed to be unconscious. I checked to make sure she was still breathing. I called Britt to come pick her up. When Britt arrived, she was in a panic. Are you okay? Did she do anything to you? My heart warmed to see she was so concerned about me. I explained to Britt that her sister tricked me, and when I remembered everything she told me, I asked her to leave. Britt shook her head and clutched her heart. She told me that one of the reasons her parents finally sent her sister away was because Britt read in her sister's diary that she wanted to slit my throat. My throat? I asked. Britt nodded. In her diary, she talked about how she'd love to explore under the skin. She wanted to see your jugular, specifically yours. I felt sick. After Britt took her sister away, I sat on the couch and finished my beer. About halfway through the beer, the room started spinning, and I had to lie down. I passed out and woke up the next morning. Sasha must have put something in my beer while I was in the bathroom. If I had drunk more, she probably would have enjoyed exploring under my skin. I never used a dating app again. I prefer to meet people the old-fashioned way.